Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is an online symposium from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. My name's Philip Murphy. I'm director of the Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all very warmly to this symposium on legacies of trade and empire. We hear a lot in this country at the moment about so-called global Britain and those historical trading networks that the UK has developed over centuries. But we all know that it's a very complex history with many disruptions, many displacements. So this online symposium will look at that difficult history, particularly looking at how the legacies of trade impacted on diaspora communities across the world. Trying to recapture some of those histories, and in the process asking, what voices do we still hear clearly from the past, and which voices have been silenced? And how do we reach those people? One of the great benefits of the move online of the last year has been the ability to connect scholars around the world with interests in particular areas. And this is a wonderful example of that. We have speakers from Germany, the Netherlands, India, the US, Canada, the Seychelles, as well as from the UK and from our own Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And I'd like to begin by paying particular tribute to Shihan De Silva, who's organized this event and a series of previous events on imperial networks. It's a fantastic program. I'm so grateful to all the experts who've agreed to speak and given up their time, and to all of you for joining us. You'll be very familiar by now with the sort of the Zoom protocols. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you're speaking. We are recording this event. We'll hopefully make it available on our website. And please use the chat function to ask questions, and our chairs will feed the questions and comments into the discussion towards the end of the session. So without further ado, let me hand over to Shihan, and thank you all very much, and very best wishes for this afternoon's discussion. Thank you. Shihan, you're muted, so you've got to.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And I'm particularly thankful to Professor Philip Murphy, the director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, for his vision in embracing multicultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Welcome everyone to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And thank you all for participating, and to some of the speakers who had to get up at various unsociable hours and for adjusting their work schedules to present at this conference. It's a pity it's not a face-to-face conference, but on the other hand, it's possible to connect across the oceans through Zoom. And our speakers today come from Commonwealth countries, Canada, India, Sri Lanka, and the UK. And the papers also reflect the Commonwealth countries: Caribbean, India, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and the Seychelles. And the complex afterlives of empire are seen in the islands, and we are particularly lucky to have some cases from those islands: the Caribbeans, the Seychelles, and Sri Lanka. The papers cut across various empires, starting from the early modern period, the Portuguese, the Dutch, French, and British. And by taking a cross-section of the European empires, it's hoped to eliminate the biases and expand perspectives on intercultural dialogues and lived experiences. After hearing the papers, we might have a good idea of how imperial legacies were shaped and the effects on the peoples. Just a few housekeeping rules. As Philip mentioned, the conference is being recorded. So please mute yourselves and also switch off your video screens because it improves the quality of the presentations. And to ask questions, you can use the chat function and the chairs will get around to them and the speakers will also keep an eye on them. And we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. But if there aren't any questions that weren't answered, you can email me, and you've all got my email. When you registered, you saw my email on that program. So I now hand over to my colleague from the University of California in Irvine to chair the first session. That's Professor Behrouz Shroff. I hand over to you.
Thank you, Shihan. Welcome, everybody. We have our first speaker. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Tom Cougarworst. We have a little change in the program because Professor Uta Fendler is not able to join us yet. Dr. Tom Cougarworst.
Yes, many thanks. I'll try to.
Yes, it's a pleasure to introduce you. I'll say a few words.
Thank you.
Dr. Tom Cougarworst is a historical linguist employed at the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. He is primarily interested in the way language can deepen our understanding of the past, including through otherwise scarcely documented episodes of interethnic contact. His PhD research focused on the pre-modern translocation of spices, plants, and other commodities from Southeast Asia to the wider Indian Ocean world. At present, he's finalizing a monograph on the linguistic character of Indonesia's Chinese printing industry, which had adopted the Malay language. Both projects touch upon food as an important historical force that can be fruitfully examined through the prism of language. Welcome, Dr. Tom Cougarworst.
Thanks a lot. And I hope my children can be reasonably quiet through today, and otherwise they'll probably regale you with guitar and all sorts of musical instruments. I'll try to do a share screen. And okay. And I think you can understand me and hear me, right? At the moment?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me start then. So first of all, thanks to all the organizers for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present some preliminary research here today before many esteemed colleagues. And I say preliminary because even visiting the archives has become rather impossible in my part of the world for about a year now. And everything I'm about to tell you today is from an incomplete combination of fieldwork and archival research and a desire to continue on this as soon as possible. And I should also say that I've had a long conversation with Dr. Shihan about the importance of Sri Lanka in the culinary networks of the Indian Ocean that I'm interested in. We talked about music, but the conversation verged towards culinary influences along the way as it goes. And I've only had one opportunity to conduct research in Sri Lanka, but I had to cut the trip short due to political instability. What I can tell, though, is that my research is not complete without going back. So let me first outline the topic. I'm interested in what happened to the cuisines of Indonesian diasporas, and I use this term with some reservations, that took place across the Indian Ocean and beyond under colonialism. And as far as I know, this topic has received very little attention. I think it tells important stories about culture and history we don't otherwise get access to. And sometimes we know almost nothing about the protagonists of culinary contact, but we do know the dishes they cooked. But first, something quick about my background. My undergraduate training was in Indonesian studies, my PhD in Indian Ocean studies, and I'm currently employed at an institute that does Caribbean studies, in addition to Southeast Asian studies. In terms of discipline, I'm interested in language and history in roughly equal measure. So I would say I'm a historical linguist. Now, to give some historical context about what I think we could call creolized Indonesian cuisines, we first need to realize that Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean more broadly was already a melting pot of local Chinese, Indian, and Middle Eastern influences prior to Western European expansion. And then we have some later influences. I hope you see the slide. I mean, this is just some examples of Portuguese introductions. I've even found a couple of things that were introduced into multiple places within the Indian Ocean world by the Dutch. And as you can see, the local names would also reflect this. The biggest culinary revolution, I would say, this part of the world was arguably the introduction of Latin American products. Let's see if this works. Introduced by the Portuguese, such as chili peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, sweet or otherwise, peanuts, maize, cocoa beans, all sorts of tropical fruits. And this would be the same in India, Sri Lanka, China, and other parts of Asia. I'm just giving some examples on the slides, but it's not meant to be exhaustive. And the early modern period is also when communities with origins in the Indonesian archipelago were moved, often against their will, to other parts of the Indian Ocean. And we see this first on the Portuguese rule. If you look at the cuisines of Portuguese-occupied cities in Asia, such as Macau, Goa, they all share some unmistakably Indonesian influences. Just a couple of examples. People have pointed this out in individual cases, but not to my knowledge from a comparative perspective. And under Dutch colonialism, we see the movement of enslaved and also exiled Indonesians to Sri Lanka and to Cape Town. And both places were subsequently colonized by the British, and under the British Crown, the so-called Malay communities, which were in fact highly diverse, continue to be identifiable. And I'll also look at the case of Suriname, a former Dutch colony in South America, which became the destination of contract laborers from the Indonesian island Java. And these case studies have in common the extreme inequalities in which people were uprooted. I'm interested in what happened to their notions of food, which we all know is something that comforts us and reminds us of home in parts of the world that were quite different in terms of the available products. So my hypothesis would be that you get processes of extreme creativity and cross-pollination with other colonized communities. So now I'm going to give 3 case studies on the broader developments I'm seeing, starting from Suriname in South America, moving to Sri Lanka in South Asia, and ending in Cape Town in Southern Africa. And I'm going to do so through 3 specific dishes in the hope that they will tell a broader story. So to start, this is a picture of sauto, which is a very popular Surinamese soup based on chicken stock, and it's enjoyed by all communities. Next to the Javanese from Indonesia, Suriname is home to indigenous people, Afro-descended people, Indians, and Chinese. And as a tropical country, its ecology is quite similar to Indonesia. And you see many of the same fruits and vegetables. And what I find most interesting is that people also incorporate products traditionally associated with other communities in their heritage cuisines. For example, masala powder from India, dried codfish in the Portuguese tradition, Chinese noodles, Javanese rice, etc. So this is the one thing I'm hoping to understand better in the foreseeable future, because in other multicultural societies, you see much less admixture. And if you go to Indonesia, the same dish is called soto, with many local variations. And its Indonesian name is slightly different and in fact more recent. So the Surinamese version is obviously experienced a different trajectory when it traveled west. And the version that traveled west was the archaic one. But at the same time, it incorporated locally available products such as Surinamese chili peppers and these crunchy rice sprinklings to give it umami. So the story so far is to some degree stuck in time, but to another degree radically localized. And this is exactly what you see with language in the diaspora. So people speak somewhat archaically, yet at the same time, it's very easy to notice the influence of all the other languages they've been in contact with. So maybe linguistic theory can be transported to culinary history in some way, but I haven't made any serious attempts yet. Now we move to Sri Lanka, and here the community labeled as Malay is considerably older. So hypothetically, that means that their cuisine is more localized and has perhaps exerted a greater influence on the neighboring cuisines compared to Suriname. And from what I've been able to read, this is indeed the case, but the real confirmation will have to come from fieldwork. And one of the most important things to take into account here is the long tradition of intermarriage between Malays and other Muslim groups, which wasn't historically the case in Suriname with its plantation-based system of indentured labor, where different groups were deliberately isolated from each other and almost never intermarried until later processes of urbanization. Let's have a look at the dish that many people will argue is typically Sri Lankan, dodol, which you see it depicted as a sweet toffee-like type of confectionery made by mixing palm sugar, coconut milk, and some other ingredients and let it thicken very slowly. And this dish, as well as its name, is very common to Southeast Asia. However, you find it all over Sri Lanka as well. And I've been told that different communities have different recipes, which indicate that dodol has become very much part of a general culinary culture, which again relates to my point of a longer tradition of cross-community marriage. I'm not idealizing or romanticizing the situation, it'd be strange to do, but it does seem to matter. And what I found in the case of dodol, and what I suspect hasn't really been followed up by anyone, is that you'll find it everywhere the Portuguese had influence, whether it's Macau, Malacca, East Indonesia, Pondicherry, Sri Lanka, Goa. Dodol, this dish, always shows up, and it's quite difficult to make. So it would seem to me that this dish, and presumably many others, achieved their popularity by the hands of enslaved or otherwise marginalized cooks from Indonesia. And since in many cases these communities no longer form a separate group, the origins of the dish were no longer realized, but what remains is equally important. All sorts of local developments and practices of cross-pollination between different ethnicities. And as I said previously, I found a couple of other dishes that appear to have traveled with the Portuguese, and I'm sure there are many more. And so I'm ending in Cape Town, South Africa. This is the place where I actually did manage to do a combination of archival research and culinary fieldwork, although not as much as I would have hoped. And this city has a very ethnically diverse, creolized history, much of which got erased and marginalized by Dutch colonialism, British colonialism, and apartheid. And as was the case in Sri Lanka, people belonging to what is labeled the Malay community, in fact, have ancestors from a great variety of places, and Malay was in some ways a colonial category, although it does hold value within the community as a link to their ancestors and culture, of which cuisine, together with religion and music, is one of the most tangible reminders. And the final dish I'd like to call attention to then is boboti, which is a delicious oven dish consisting of delicately spiced minced meat covered with layers of eggs. And many people promote this dish as quintessentially South African, but in doing so, they're also at risk of erasing the specific Malay origins. And this issue becomes sensitive when the people who benefit from its popularity are other communities. So marginalizing in the process the historically enslaved or exiled families that introduced the dish. And so many other dynamics come into play here. One is gentrification of historically Malay majority parts of Cape Town. You see that in the picture, protests. Another one is the marginalized livelihood of fishermen from this community. And a third one is a marginalization in history books. There are food historians arguing, to my mind, against all evidence that the dish is in fact a European invention. But in reality, there's an Indonesian dish, boboto, which consists of spiced meat cooked in fragrant leaves. And since these particular leaves didn't grow in South Africa, one can easily see how the recipe was subsequently made in the oven. So this is another example of culinary creativity that I'm interested in. The localization of traditional food according to new situations. And in interesting ways, that also brings me back to language, because language too can be marginalized from mainstream historiography. And we still see the effects of this everywhere. One prominent instance is the fact that the first people who wrote in Afrikaans were ethnically Malay descended people using the Arabic script, and they were not Dutch descended. So to call Afrikaans a European language is to partly erase that history. To call boboti a European dish is to do the same. And that brings me to a broader point on erasure. Because I realize that most of my colleagues are not really interested in roots, but more in routes. I personally think that when it comes to food as well as language, both are important to tell the story of how dishes traveled, adapted, accompanied people. So I don't see the harm in pointing out that certain, say, South African dishes were reinvented in fascinating ways by some of Cape Town's oldest families with roots in the Indonesian archipelago and with origins in slavery and exile. I think that if popular journalism is anything to go by, this is a topic that interests almost everyone. I would immediately add that on a grassroots level, the production and the trajectories of food are characterized by deep inequalities and much human suffering. This is still the case. But on an intellectual level, it brings out an important proclivity in us, which is to connect and in some cases reconnect with each other and try new things, both on our plates, in the seminar rooms, etc. So with that being said, I'm grateful for your attention and I'm looking forward to your feedback. And now let me see if I can stop sharing.
Okay. Thank you very much for that presentation, Dr. Tom Cougarworst. I'm intrigued by how you traveled over spaces and brought together so many different cuisines. And you mentioned roots and roots. James Clifford's most famous work. And I congratulate you on the fact that you have contributed immensely to what is now becoming an academic study called foodways. And its growing importance, as you point out, in terms of bringing together histories of enslavement, and at the same time, the marginalization of the people who actually introduced the food, the commodification, and the marketing of foods that sometimes then get confused, whose origins get confused. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit in terms of tourism and how tourism has contributed to the commodification of these foods, which brings people together at one point, and yet the control of the markets and the control of the resources is in the hands of either multinationals, hotel chains. So if you could elaborate a little bit, and I thank you very much for, I'm already hungry looking at your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm sorry if I made people hungry. I realized I shouldn't have done that, but yeah, this is something I've come across myself as well, and it's very interesting that you mention hotel chains specifically, because indeed they are the ones that, of course, benefit from this the most. The moment you have a well-promoted cuisine, it's typically not the people who say whose heritage it has been intergenerationally that benefit from it. So I don't know what to do about that, but I think it's an important observation to be made. And that would explain some of the other dynamics that are going on as well. That being said, in the, say, specific case studies, I see huge differences. And that's something I'd like to explore more in the future, in which there are settings in which people have a very strong preference of only eating their own heritage cuisine, whereas in other basically settings, everybody eats the cuisine of everyone. Now, why would this be the case? And I don't know the answer, but I think it's important to figure this out as well. Now, to go back to your question, I think that is a very important thing to take in mind, the commodification, which plays a role also within these communities, because there might be entrepreneurs within the community who I think rightfully create an infrastructure for these cuisines to survive and to gain in popularity. But then it happens from the community itself. For example, these ready-made packages that you have for a certain Surinamese food, and you find it in Cape Town as well, sort of the ready-made biryani package, which then of course is different from the Indian biryani, and all these regional preferences come into play as well. So if it's some sort of grassroots initiative, the dynamic is different again. It is also very different if the nation state or people acting on behalf of it get involved, because what you see then is an attempt to basically delineate it from what is arguably similar traditions in other countries. The nation state doesn't want that. It wants to be unique. This is something I see a lot in Southeast Asia, where, for example, you have Indonesian and Malaysian and Singaporean cuisines that are extremely interrelated and extremely sort of, but then of course, the nation state doesn't want it because they want to promote a certain dish in their tourism campaign, for example. Very complex issues, but thank you for bringing it up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very illuminating. And I just have one more comment, that the package of travel and tourism, airlines also offer the food. So you have that combination of airlines, tourism, and then the hotel chains. So those also as you may have discovered, contribute to the packaging of foods. And in this case, the continued marginalization of the people who actually invented these dishes. So let me see if there might be questions later, but is there any other comment that you would like to make, Dr. Cougarworst?
Yeah, thanks again for that. And also the airports themselves, I found. I mean, in some airports, you get a very good idea of what the cuisine in the country is like. But if you go to Dubai, for example, you have no idea what people there eat. So I'm not sure about that either, but I did notice that as well. It's one of the dynamics.
Right, right. Thank you very much.
And
So, yes, Shihan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Tom, for bringing in a very important aspect of migration, food, something that has been marginalized in academic studies and something that perhaps some communities hold on to as the last aspect when they assimilate or integrate. I just wondered if food can tell us something about the circumstances of migration, and I'm thinking of Indian Ocean, African migration, where people could hardly take anything with them other than memories. So in my experience, gender plays a role, whether there were women involved who could cook. And also it shows their creative, innovative adaptability, because if you couldn't have the same yams in Africa, are you going to use local Sri Lankan manioc instead of African cassava, things like that. So is that something that applies to this Indonesian migration, to the Southeast Asians that went across?
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely central to it. And you see it the most in cases where the climate, the ecology is different. They, even if they wanted to, they couldn't cultivate the crops they used to because it wouldn't grow in a different ecological zone. Absolutely. I mean, gender is crucial to it. And it's also one additional layer of historiographical erasure, right? Because people who don't leave a paper trail tend not to be picked up by conventional historians, even though there's a lot of sort of new generation historians, of course, who are very interested in that. But it's absolutely at the core of it. And I think what you say, memory, is extremely strong, maybe because it is the only thing people have. And so it becomes extremely important. And you see all sorts of amazingly creative processes to make that memory into something tangible through food. I had 3 examples, but I'm sure if fieldwork becomes possible again, this could be a book project even.
So we go to our next speaker, and that is Dr. Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya, the convener of the conference. So I'm very privileged to introduce Dr. Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya, who has an impressive biography behind her. Dr. Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya is a pioneering scholar in the Indian Ocean World Studies. My introduction to Indian Ocean World Studies as a documentary filmmaker and a scholar of Siddhis was through her work. She is an elected fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland. She has published 6 books, edited 2 books, and co-authored Land and Maritime Empires in the Indian Ocean through Catholic University Press Milan in 2018. Her monographs include The Portuguese in the East, A Cultural History of a Maritime Trading Empire, Bloomsbury Publishers, 2008. She co-edited The African Diaspora in the Indian Ocean with Professor Richard Pankhurst, OBE, which has become an important pedagogical tool in Indian Ocean studies. It's a textbook that you see in university bookstores in African American studies and Africana studies departments. And now, of course, this new discipline called Indian Ocean World. Dr. Shihan De Silva Jayasuriya produced ethnographic films, and her work in films is on Creole cultures and Afro-Asians in the Indian Ocean world. She has numerous publications in peer-reviewed journals, academic journals. She has served as elected reporter of the UNESCO Slave Route Project, Paris, where she represents Asia in the Bureau. Currently, she is the UN expert on Afro-descendants in Asia with the UN Office of the High Commission of Human Rights in Geneva. With that impressive bio, I welcome Dr. Shihan De Silva Jayasuriya's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Behrouz, for that glowing introduction. Okay, so let me do my screen sharing and get, I should be able to have my PowerPoint. Now you can see Leonard Wolff.
Yeah, can you do a full screen?
Yes, reading view, that's good.
Yes, yes, that's very good.
Okay, thank you. So there are many facets to Leonard Wolff. He is an important figure in international relations and imperial history. And there are biographies by Vanessa Bell and Victoria Glendenning. But I just want to point out a few important aspects about him. In 1916, his Fabian reports on the prevention of war were published as International Government. And he was the secretary of the Labour Party Advisory Committee also from 1919 to 1945. And apart from that, he was the literary editor of several political journals, The Nation, The New Statesman, and the Political Quarterly, for example. But today I'm going to concentrate on him as a writer. He was a novelist, a short story writer. He also left us his autobiographies, and there are his letters and diaries. Leonard Wolff also became an important publisher of modernist literature. And he established his own press, the Hogarth Press, which he worked with his wife, Virginia Stephen. And some might know Virginia more than they know Leonard Wolff. But I'm going to concentrate on his novel, Village in the Jungle, and today show you what I think about him. So Richard Murphy, in his foreword to The Village in the Jungle, puts it on par with E.M. Foster's Passage to India and George Orwell's Burmese Days. But we have to understand that those two were written after Leonard Wolff's Village in the Jungle. 11 years after The Passage to India was written, and 20 years afterwards, the Burmese Days came out. So many literary analysts have studied Village in the Jungle, but I'm going to look at it today from the point of view of a linguist and as a Sinhala mother tongue speaker. Because the Sinhala translation of the novel, Baddagama, was a text for my Sinhala GCE ordinary level exams in Sri Lanka many moons ago. Sri Lanka's location in the Eastern Indian Ocean at the crossroads of Southeast Asia and East Africa makes it an important trading point. So from ancient times, Romans, Greeks, Arabs, Persians, Indians, Malays, Indonesians, Africans, and Chinese traded on the island. And we know that from archaeological evidence. But the Portuguese encounter, which began in the early modern period in 1505, broadened the culture spectrum of the island, introducing Western values. And the Dutch, who ousted the Portuguese in 1658, stayed on until 1796, when they handed the maritime areas to the British. And in 1802, Ceylon became a crown colony. The whole island then was brought under British rule in 1815, and that was at the third attempt by taking over the central Kandyan kingdom. And Sri Lanka regained her independence in 1948. So on the 16th of December 1904, Leonard Wolff, a 24-year-old classics graduate from Trinity College, University of Cambridge, arrived in Sri Lanka. And the 7 years he spent there had a lasting effect on his life. And these effects are felt in Britain also, in the sociopolitics and in the literary scene. Leonard Wolff worked in 3 provinces of Sri Lanka. He first started in the north, in Jaffna. Then he worked in Kandy in the central province, and finally in the southern province in Hambantota. He spent 4 years in Hambantota as the assistant government agent. And as the chief administrator and judicial officer, he administered 100,000 people. So though Leonard Wolff was a classicist, imbued with the epistemologies of Greek and Latin languages, histories, and literatures, his horizons broadened in Sri Lanka. And in the southern province, his interest in Sri Lankans took a firm grip on him as he distanced himself from his Cambridge intellectual English past. And as D.C.R.A. Gunatilaka, Emeritus Professor of English of the University of Sri Lanka, says, Leonard Wolff, in his Divided Mind, that Leonard Wolff, and I quote Professor Gunatilaka, had acquired a humane concern for the common villager, and that it was his Hambantota experiences that were reshaped in his novel, The Village in the Jungle. So Leonard Wolff wrote the novel after resigning from the British Civil Service in 1911 and returning to England. It's a reflective narrative, partly fiction, but draws upon his empathy with Sri Lanka and impressions that he gained in the Hambantota district. The Village in the Jungle was written in London at a crucial time in Leonard Wolff's life, shortly after he married Virginia Stephen in 1912. And it was part of this process in which he was changing direction. He decided not to continue in the civil service. And the novel was published in London by Edwin Arnold in 1913. To give Leonard Wolff his due, we need to acknowledge his achievement as a colonial officer in understanding the minds of those whom he administered. Village in the Jungle has not been valued, though, for its hybrid linguistic energy that I felt when I reread the novel in English just a few years ago. So today I'm going to explore the linguistic attempt to reproduce Sinhala in English, which reveals his idiomatic grasp of Sinhala. In his autobiography, Leonard Wolff wrote that it was worth coming to Ceylon, as the British call the island, to live in this house, the residency in Hambantota, the picture which you see. And I am familiar with the southern province because my ancestors come from that area. But I went back to Hambantota a few years ago and looked at the residency and experienced the sound of the sea and things that inspired Leonard Wolff to go on working in that house. So the Village in the Jungle story revolves around a hunter, Silindu, and his twin daughters, Punchimanika and Hinihami. Leonard Wolff chose to write about a jungle village where the people are doubly marginalized. Marginalized because they are villagers and marginalized because they are jungle dwellers. So in this context, jungle could represent the struggle of the characters portrayed in the novel. A renowned scholar of Jane Austen and emeritus professor of English, Yasmin Gunaratne, who published an annotated version of Village in the Jungle, she points out that the Sinhala translation, Badagama, meaning jungle village, indicates to Sinhala speakers that the novel is set in rural Sri Lanka. And that's what that name Badagama immediately signals to us. Wolff was captivated by the wilderness, and his naturalistic observations are vividly described. In the opening passage, he situates the reader in Badagama, and I quote, "The jungle surrounded it, overhung it, and continually pressed in upon it," unquote. The Village in the Jungle is the first among early 20th century English novels which depicts the lives of the indigenous people in a British colony. It's an important work in colonial literature, bridging the dichotomy between the colonizer and the colonized through the use of idiomatic Sinhala. Village in the Jungle became part of the school pedagogy, both for Sinhala language and English literature, and is today a text in the undergraduate university courses. So English continues in Sri Lanka today as a legacy of colonialism and was the dominant language at independence in 1948. But as you know, language is key to national identity. And not surprisingly, there were changes to language policies, and those followed 8 years after independence. The vernacular languages, Sinhala and Tamil, came into prominence from 1956 and 1958, with English also being officially reinforced in 1987 as a linked language, not an official language. Now I want to concentrate on Leonard Wolff's hybrid language, which indigenizes the novel. Wolff recalled Sinhala script. He could write the Sinhala, which has a distinct, its own script. It's not the Roman script. It's not even Devanagari script. And so after returning to England, he used to make notes about Virginia, his wife's illnesses, in Sinhala, so that she couldn't understand his comments. So he kept that memory alive. And his mastery of the Sinhala idiom and the nuances are quite obvious in the phrases, the utterances, and exclamations that he used in the novel. So these words are linguistically significant, and they fall into semantic areas that are typical of borrowings of bilinguals. So the words that are borrowed from one language to another by strategies like code mixing and code switching. So by including Sinhala, he enhances the hybrid nature of the novel. So I've got here some examples to show you. Nanchahami umbe kata miris wage sarai. So if you translate it in English, it sounds odd for somebody who is sharp-tongued to say your tongue is still as sharp as chilies. And then Mava karadere dan. So to put me into trouble, that is not the way you would say it in English. If I refuse Korala Mahatya, he'll be angry and he'll put me into trouble. And this phrase, tikyak pisu, it's a very Sri Lankan phrase, which doesn't mean someone is mad or crazy, but it's someone is a bit off the rails, maybe. And in Sri Lanka, in this village, the woman doesn't refer to her husband as her husband. She refers to her husband as the father of her son, which is very odd for English-speaking people. So she would say, Podisinho is her son, the father of Podisinho. And here are some interesting examples that I picked out. There are Sinhala personal names he uses in green highlighted in that column. Anguhami, the names of characters. Appochi, kinship terms. Then exclamations like ayo, ane, things like that. And words to do with flora and also fauna. So chena is land cleared for cultivation. Then currency like fanam, and institutions, kacheri, place names, and several of them, Kamburupitiya is just one example. And of course, job titles like Mudalali, Korele Mahatya, things like that. And diseases like Parangi. Also temporal elements like Paya, ethnic names like Vadda, the original inhabitants of Sri Lanka, and swear words like Vesige Mau. And interestingly, he uses hybrid names for characters. And here, Don is a Portuguese honorific prefix from Dom, and Andres is from Dutch, Andreas, and Archige is the Sri Lankan way of saying you belong to a ge, meaning gedara or house. So that would be the English equivalent of a surname, you know, where somebody belongs. So Baddagamba was popularized through the cinema in Sri Lanka in 1964, and the film was directed by internationally renowned director Lester James Pearis. And the 140-minute film was screened also in the UK in Channel 4. And in 1981, it was screened in France, and here Telirama praised the film and put it on the same pedestal as Satyajit Ray's Partha Panchali. And some of you familiar with South Asian culture would know Satyajit Ray and his films. So Leonard Wolff became ambivalent about the British government's mismanagement of jungle agriculture. The power structures that he came across raised his sensibilities on socio-political issues. And 5 years ago, in 2016, I gave lectures on the political agenda behind the literary work at the International Center for Ethnic Studies in Kandy, the headquarters, and also its branch in Colombo. And this was a newspaper advertisement. The active interest in reviving colonial memories was brought home to me by the huge turnout and academically oriented audience. There was press coverage, and journalist Ishara Javadana wrote this article to the Daily News. And he included pictures of Leonard Wolff. You may have seen this. Leonard Wolff was a workaholic working at his desk. And this is the picture of Leonard and Virginia. You'll find that in his autobiography, and this other picture, his portrait. And up here is Mr. Ockers, Lynn Ockers, the Daily News editor who chaired the event. And this is myself. You will recognize me. So Judith Hirsch says that the novel is a profoundly anti-imperialist text and writing of, and I quote her, the absurdity of a people of one civilization and mode of life trying to impose its rule upon a people of an entirely different civilization and mode of life, unquote. So, but although Leonard Wolff was immensely successful within the colonial machinery, he acquired a distaste for power and he turned his back on the empire. And I quote him from his autobiography. I did not want to be a successful imperialist, to become a colonial secretary or a governor. His Excellency, Sir Leonard Wolff, KCMG. But some, of course, consider Leonard Wolff an imperialist. Neville Javira, a leading civil servant who was government agent in Jaffna, had met senior professionals who remembered Wolff, and I quote, an arrogant imperialist, although they conceded that he was also a sensitive and fair-minded magistrate, unquote. So if this was so, then Leonard Wolff has undergone a transformation in the southern province, in Hambantota. Sir Christopher Ondaatje, a Sri Lankan financier and writer who wrote the afterword to the Eland edition of Village in the Jungle, says that, and I quote Sir Christopher, that it shows a remarkable, deep empathy for the hard lives of poor Sinhalese jungle dwellers and their psychology, and gives a devastating portrayal of the irrelevance of the colonial regime to their needs and world. So to conclude, Leonard Wolff's epistemology of Sri Lankan ethnography, sociology, philosophy of Buddhism and Hinduism all enhance the novel's realism. But I read it through it an encoded message for decolonization. His position in between Jewish and English cultures puts him in a third space, which enhanced his sensibilities. But above all, Leonard Wolff's proficiency in Sinhala enabled him to enter the Sinhalese minds and to write a hybrid novel using creative storytelling techniques. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Shihan, for that wonderful presentation and bringing back Leonard Wolff from the archive and his importance in terms of understanding that the contact zone can transform the colonizer in different ways as well, and that the colonizer becomes an anti-colonial agent. What's interesting to me, and we have discussed this often, is the use of the word jungle. And it brings to mind, of course, Rudyard Kipling and his characterization of Mowgli and the parody that Rudyard Kipling has made of forest inhabitants as quote unquote primitive. So, and you also bring up E.M. Foster. E.M. Foster brings into his novel gender and sexuality, especially in Passage to India, where the young woman, the young British woman, Adela, has this kind of hallucination of the Indian man being a rapist. So we have different people writing about the colonial subject in terms of their perceptions as colonizers, as agents of the colonial empire. And how, if you would like to comment on the use of the word jungle in relationship to, say, Rudyard Kipling, and in relation to E.M. Foster, who looks at India through the lens of sexuality and desire. If you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, I think on working on this presentation, what brings home to me is how Leonard Wolff stands apart from those other colonial writers. And as linguistically, to be able to write like that, he really had to be bilingual. So I think, as Professor Yasmin Gunaratna points out, Badegama doesn't imply what you said implied to, with the word jungle. It simply means rural people, Badegama, rural dwellers. So it is not used in a condescending way by Leonard Wolff. In his autobiographies, they're very interesting. When he left the civil service, he had certain options. He wasn't sure whether Virginia would marry him. And option 1, if she would marry him, he would stay in London and make a living. And option 2, if she didn't marry him, he would go out to the colonies and he would go to Ceylon, he would marry a Sinhalese, and he would make the province of Hambantota the best in Asia. So I think he was quite an unusual character. And the more I read him, and here I'm going back many years and trying to bridge the gap in my life of knowing the area and also reading it first in Sinhala and then reading the English version, I just wondered whether he was alienating the English readers first. You know, there are so many probabilities of his strategy of writing this unusually styled novel. And of course, it didn't get recognition at the time, you know, not even by Virginia, who preferred his second novel, The Wise Virgins, said that was better than Village in the Jungle. And his closest friends like Lytton Strachey said, and I quote him, it's nothing but the black. It's about nothing but the blacks. So you can understand that this was a period when Jewish people were coming to Britain, and Leonard Wolff obviously felt an outsider within that Bloomsbury circle, in the insideness of in the close circles, because when he took Virginia when she wasn't well, and for her health, he moved to Richmond, to outside London. He was perfectly happy to live there and do his work, but she needed to go back to Bloomsbury to be happy and to be laughing with her friends. So you can see that though his father was a lawyer and they were well off until he died, a family of 9 children who suddenly, when the father died, you know, went into relative economic hardship, and he wins a scholarship to go to Cambridge. He got a first class in his part 1 of the tripos. He missed out on getting a first class on the final part. And then what was open to him when he joined the civil service was not to work in Britain, but to go to an outpost. So that's how he ended up going to Sri Lanka. And if he started in the north, and if people saw him as an imperialist, perhaps he came in with the ideas, you know, that were imbibed in him. So he started in Jaffna with that, and then he came to central, the Kandy, and by the time he comes to his Hambantota, which was by the sea and isolated, you know, there were no Englishmen for thousands of miles. So there was no chance of him socializing. He was immersed in the Sri Lankan, and more particularly in that area, Sinhalese culture. And there he makes the crossover and understands the Sinhalese mind, and understands the complications of their lives within the forest, within the Sri Lankan administration, and outside that, the British administration. So all those wheels of power turning together simultaneously.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question and a comment from Joanna Passos. And I think you would like to comment on that, Shihan. She says to Mariana, another colleague who is present in the audience, just consider Shihan's example using bilingualism, confronting Europeans with the appropriation of European languages and their immersion into with other cultures and languages. To assert the value of a mixed heritage cancels ideas of purity, fundamentalism, or Eurocentrism, as the West has to acknowledge and be indebted for everything that he learned. I guess she's talking about Leonard Wolff, and he learned from Southern and Asian cultures. So she's commenting on the fact that the contact zone produces this kind of shift from Eurocentrism, ideas of purity, fundamentalism. It's a very good comment in terms of what you have just presented. And I'm wondering if you'd like to add to it, but there is also another comment from Neil van der Linden. Given the impression that apparently some others had about Wolff as arrogant, is it possible that Wolff had a different image of himself as a colonial mediator, or wanted to give a different image others had? So was he writing this to prove something to the people who called him arrogant? That is a good question from Neil van der Linden. So if you'd like to address both.
Yes, Joanna, thank you. I can see Joanna, and I met her in Portugal I think some years ago. Yes, nice to see you. Yes, I mean, this Leonard Wolff situation is different to the normal linguistic situation in colonial contact, where colonizers, Europeans, made word lists for their own purposes, for spreading their religions or for administration. So though there is some element of that, I mean, Leonard Wolff really crossed over to the other side, from what you can, from what I can see from the novel. Yes, so yes, it does nullify the Eurocentrism. And perhaps what Ute was trying to talk of about the choral identities and equal relationships, in contact situations and symbiosis, of course, Leonard was alone. He was, I mean, this was in India as well the case. The Englishman was the only Englishman for miles and miles, they had to get on with the locals. So, maybe it's symbiosis as well, but whatever the circumstances. And maybe it's his own ability to grasp languages. If he's done Latin and Greek, he already comes with that kind of linguistic acumen in him. And yes, Neil's idea of, can you repeat that about arrogance?
Given the impression that apparently some others had about Wolff as arrogant, is it possible that Wolff had a different image of himself as a colonial mediator, or wanted to give a different image than others had?
Possible, but then he still wasn't a governor. He didn't have all my mighty power. He was just one. He was somebody who wanted a radical, somebody who wanted change. But height of the British Empire, a Jewish Englishman, young, 26, 28, 29, 30. So it is quite difficult for him. How much can he mediate against that? And yes, was a very difficult decision for him to resign, because he would become, as he says, a penniless Jew, So it's hard times and hard decisions. And there are various accusations, about him and his relationship with Virginia, but I think that's another chapter. That's another issue, not really to do with the village in the jungle in Sri Lanka. Yes. Mm-hmm. But one wonders if he really married a Sinhalese and lived in Hambantota, what would the world have ever known? Village in the jungle? Perhaps not. Perhaps he wouldn't have written this novel if he lived there. Perhaps his alienation, and reflecting back on what he left behind while in London, and of course the need that the Bloomsbury set were coming up with new types of novels made him come up with these. Yes.
Mm-hmm. There is, thank you, Shihan. There is yet another comment from Mariana Pereira, which she has addressed to Joanna, but it would be interesting for us to look at. It follows from Professor Fendler's. It's good to have this dialogue with the other papers also. Professor Fendler and Joanna Passos again commenting on the fact that she's a post-colonial studies scholar, and she uses hybridity and creolisation both. And they can be empowering terms. It depends on how you use them. To which Mariana responds, this is a very lively dialogue. Thank you, both of you. It would be great to know more about empowerment through those terms, and who is empowering whom. I have been struggling quite a lot with both concepts, as they are mostly imposed by scholars upon communities that are deemed mixed by those same scholars. So Shihan, maybe you would like to respond to that, and maybe Professor Fendler too might want to respond to the fact that both concepts are imposed by scholars upon communities that are deemed mixed by those same scholars. Yes, very interesting.
Yes, thank you, Mariana, for that interesting question. I think that's what I was telling Ute, that we in Sri Lanka, the people mixed people tell me that it's the scholars who call them Creoles. We in Sri Lanka never called them Creoles. So I think I will then pass over to Uta to answer that question if she's still around. Is she still around? Yes.
Yeah, I'm here. Imposed on other people, yes. Very often concepts are imposed on other people. I mean, I think the concepts, I used before some time ago, I still used hybridity. I don't use it anymore. I try to avoid it because of the racial and the biological connotations that are very strong. Even if the idea that it wants to transmit is there, and I would acknowledge that, but I think the burden is too heavy, so I would not use that at all anymore, me personally. Creolization, I think, would then be more open and allow us more to, in different ways to deal with different phenomena. I mean, the fact that, as you say, the problem is if you want to talk about certain things that we see and observe, and we have to talk about it, we need words to talk about it. Now, as you say, in the context you are working in, if this is not even a phenomena that would be turned into a question, this would be then interesting. But so if there's no thinking about it in the same way, how would it still then be addressed with which kind of concepts and words, you know? This is like when I said in the end that the Senegalese philosopher would even borrow the concept of Ubuntu because he's not happy with the word of relation. But in the end, and I agree that in the end, the ideas are the same. But then always looking for something that really can convey only a certain idea and concept without imposing something on the world and the living of people. So my question, I would give it back to you and say, so what kind of concepts and words would you suggest us, or are there in your context where you work, so that you can still talk about people coming from different cultural backgrounds and maybe combine and merge them?
It's a colonial, particularly with the British population censuses that they introduced in categorizing ethnicities, that these differences came, people had to identify themselves as one or the other. So officially the father's ethnicity becomes important. So the mother, the women are not important. But before that, they lived in harmony. They didn't question. And, you know, I see the point that differences can be exacerbated once the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British entered the scene. You know, but it's not based on skin color alone, because we've got the Chinese, we've got the Arabs, we've got the Persians. So this becomes a very complex question, because we have a less marked caste system in Sri Lanka, because the Buddhism, the 75% of Buddhist population, the Buddha renounced, he was born a Hindu and renounced the caste system, was one of the biggest things he was against, that if somebody was born a Brahmin or born into the Harijans. So no, so we don't have those same ideas of caste as India would. So I know India has color problems. Mm-hmm. And people in Sri Lanka also, after colonization, begin to realize, look for the fairer skin, you know, when children are born, etc. But, you know, I don't know. I mean, really, it's something that's, again, just like the Atlantic Ocean, something that's brought about after colonization, but by European colonization. And when I say colonization and empires, there were empires before the European empires. So we, you know, those, the mixing and the people who, the outcome of those are different.
Mariana has raised her hand and would like to talk. Mariana, let me see where you are.
Hi.
Yes, go ahead and speak.
Hello, Shihan. It's so nice to see you. Maybe do you want to stop sharing your screen so that we can kind of see everyone?
Okay.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I don't want to interrupt the flow. I just want to give a context to why my comment is there, because I'm from the Portuguese descendant community of Macanese, so from Macau in China. And I think in Asia, we do have a very different perception of who we are, because, oh, sorry if you can hear in the background a bit of noise, but because we did not see ourselves as mixed. Other people saw that, right? I'm not saying there's a way out for now, but I do know that some distinctions, for example, were made because some people wore hats, not because of their skin color, but because of how they behaved and positioned themselves in relation to others based on their behavior or going to church. So we have here the factor of religion being important, and not necessarily whether you had less melanin than other people. I think Asia can provide some help in terms of moving on from these perceptions that derive a lot from the Atlantic slave trade, that have their own very specific context that absolutely needs to be addressed, perhaps in these very specific ways. But when we put hybridity and creolization on Asia, it becomes really complicated because it was not perceived that way. So that's just what I wanted to say in the comment. I don't have an answer. I just know that I don't see myself as mixed, but the references that come from Portugal are all that we are mixed. So it's just like, okay, so, well, yeah, Joanna.
Joanna would like to answer. Joanna, would you like to?
No, yes, of course, not at all. I think Portugal does not read at all. I'm speaking for the debate here in the Portuguese Academy. That's not a relevant issue to begin with. No, not at all. Either you have people that are doing research on the cultural heritage of certain places, and then what would be interested is not skin color at all, it's the heritage. Cultural heritage as a mixed product. What came out of it, if there's something interesting, if it's a relevant issue for you in Macau. If it is not, then that is not addressed. And now let me rephrase the context. For instance, now here in Portugal, in terms of music, to reclaim this mixed heritage is very important. Why? Because Afro-Portuguese music is the most successful one. And it is also a music production that asserts the value of a certain community and reclaims visibility and power. So in that sense, it's something that is coveted, if I'm explaining right. When I was making a comment on Sheehan's linguistic analysis of the text, I had something a bit different from the example of Leonard Wolff in my mind. I was thinking of all the African writers writing in Portuguese, that when they write their own version of Portuguese, they are asserting their culture and saying, look, Portuguese does not belong to Portugal. The Portuguese belongs to the people that speak it here in another country, and I use Portuguese as I want, with my rules in my own way, so it is an assertive gesture. But in terms of linguistic systems, what you get on your page, it's a mixture. Maybe Uta is right, maybe I should not call it hybrid, but then, for example, you have a page in Portuguese and have, for example, 5 or 6 words of Kimbundu or Umbundu or any African language, and the word sentence can be made to reproduce certain oral traditions that are not Portuguese. So it's assertive, it's self-assertive. And you have all these positives, all these empowering connections associated to mixing references. And again, as you can see from my examples, there's nothing to do with looking at people and their skin color. It has to do with artistic creativity, with contemporary cultural products and how the public receives them and how we understand them. In this case, I gave examples from music and from writing. So I think I made my point clearer now. Thank you. And hi, Sheehan. You met me in London. No, you met me in Brighton, I guess.
All right.
Not in Portugal.
Nice to see you again.
Okay. Very good. Very good. I love this dialogue that's going on between the participants and the panelists. And Uta, if you would like to address that, Shihan, if you would like to build on the comments, because I do have one more question from for Uta. Go ahead.
I think
Uta.
Uta would like, if Uta wants to comment
Yes.
anything.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what both of you said before, but I think that even if you talk about music, and it's also, I mean, it's something different. I think if we talk about mixture of different cultural heritages, and in which context we do so. If it's about power relations that are reflected in this kind of mixture, or if we just describe that there's a mixture. I mean, without any, my God, English today is not my English day today. Without any, how do you say, judgment? Yeah, without any judgment. You see, because everything else would be like a moral and judgment when I talk about races. So the one is bad, the other one is good, or the other one is higher. I mean, it's about power relations and who has access to certain things. So I think it's not bad to talk about hybrid, maybe if you talk about a mixture of cultures. But the question is, when, but this would be another discussion. When does racism and the concepts of race, when does it enter our, I mean, the ideas, and how this will link them with other concepts of imperialism and everything else. Yeah. So I think it's also two different things. And I mind Asia, I don't know a lot about where you come up, but I mean, there are also other cases, I think, where you would have, I mean, where is the pure blood is even today then a very important part of the discourse. If I think of South Korea, for example. So it depends on, I guess it also depends on where, I mean, on which country we talk, I mean, which culture, which epoch, which relations we talk about. So it's, yeah.
It has to be concrete.
Yes, and otherwise, yeah. I don't think that we are far away from each other. There's just a lot of things involved at all the levels.
Oh, yes, okay.
Mm-hmm. I had one more question for Professor Fendler. Since you are also a film scholar, the Martinican film, Rue Casa Negre, translated as Sugarcane Alley, which was adapted from a novel, Martinican novel, also looks at assimilation, which was the French colonizers, I guess, benchmark compared to the British as colonizers, who were much more open, perhaps, to the cultures. So, but Rue Casa Negre looks at the contact zone as very productive, as leading to education is the key, and that French education for a Black Martinican boy was the way out, the way forward. Now, in Martinique, of course, they use the word creolisation, but I would like you to comment on this idea of the contact zone as being productive and seen as the way forward. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, we still have time. I would totally agree that the contact zone is definitely productive. What I tried to say with some of the things, the quotations I had in the end, also about everything creation will be the creation will be a change in its freedom. It will open up to something different. In this sense, La Rue Casa Negre, this novel, and also the film, I would not use this as a good example in this context, because this is on the one side, it's a very nostalgic one. Has been very much criticized for the representation also of the life back then, also about the politics of assimilation, and I think it's a very good example exactly for the French politics. I mean, till today, if you look at, I mean, the subgenre of French cinema, just about schools and how educate. I mean, the myth that education will allow you to climb the social ladder. Mm-hmm. Which is not really the case. Yeah, depends. It's not really the case. So it's really a very, it's just because also in France, language is not just a means of communication, but it's really the marker of identity. So if you don't speak correct French, you can never be French, independently of your passport and even the best manners and everything. It's really about language, and then all this, everything else we're talking about, all the, let's say West, for example, Ivory Coast and others who write in a Africanized French. I mean, it took a long time, decades, till France would then, but also for other reasons, for merchandising and everything else, why then they came up to accept it. But I mean, comments on this kind of literature is still a bit, yeah, oh, look at this exotic. This is the richness of our former empire. They will not call it empire, but Francophonie. But in the end, it will come up to that. I'm not sure if I really answered now. I think I lost now.
No, I think you answered it very well. You answered it very well, because that was
I got lost somewhere in the middle of Rulkas Negre and the French education system.
The French colonizers were different in terms of how they made identity authentic if it was Frenchified. And that is a lot about what Frantz Fanon is talking about in Wretched of the Earth. So thank you. That was very, very nice. Very good comment. Shihan is going to offer a comment.
Wanted to add an addendum to what Uta was saying about language being very important, and speaking correct French was very important. And of course, this was a difference again between the French and the Portuguese. So with the Portuguese, Pidgin Portuguese, Creole Portuguese, broken, what historians wrote as broken Portuguese, bastard Portuguese, all those things were acceptable. Yes, but my supervisor worked on Mauritian French Creole, and he wrote a paper called Off Target, where he talks about the Caribbean and the idea that people had that these incoming slaves were trying to acquire the European language and fell short of acquiring the European language and started speaking bad French. So instead, he says that Africans never wanted to lose their languages. It's just that the Africans were a heterogeneous group and they couldn't speak to the Europeans with the African languages. So they evolved another kind of language, intermediary language, as a medium of inter-ethnic communication. And that is different to the racist or power relationships, where you're trying to say, okay, they're trying to be like us, but they can't quite become like us. So they're not falling short. And nobody ever wants to lose their language. Nobody wants to lose their mother tongue. Because we know that from examples of Africans who went to the Sindh, Sir Richard Burton, how he wrote about the people, the Afro-Sindhis, the people who married with the Sindhis, were trying to speak to the incoming Africans in their African languages. So they wanted to keep that language going as long as possible. So I thought that's important to add in terms of the linguistic differences in the colonizers within that same Catholic model.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting discussion. We do have our next speaker, Dr. Frederick Noronha. And I'd like to introduce him. Dr. Frederick Noronha has been an avid student of Goa since the early 1980s, first as a journalist, photographer, and bibliophile, and since 2007 as a book publisher. After spending a lifetime working in the real world, he successfully defended his thesis on publishing in 20th century Goa in January 2021. Congratulations. Through the Goa University. He is an independent researcher. Thank you, Dr. Noronha.
Thank you, Professor Shroff. I guess I'm audible enough. Yeah.
Yes.
If that's it, yeah, I'll just go ahead and share my screen. and I just so just in a word, I'm clearly the outlier here, and I've not been in academia, and my topic is a bit off. It's very different from where I come, and the place which I'm talking about is going to sound also very different, because it's not the kind of place that fits in very easily into the broader scheme of understanding Asia, understanding South Asia. And in that sense, I've deliberately chosen the title of Not by the Cross Alone. The study links to my research in the world of 20th century publishing in Goa and the print history of Goa. Goa is a small place on the west coast of India, as you know, today known more as a tourist destination, as a hippie destination from the 60s, a very kind of different place from the role it has played in history. And the title of my talk was provoked by the one line that a significant part, in my view, of Goan history gets dismissed with. So when anyone talks about the printing press, the first printing press in Asia, the first Gutenberg style printing press in Asia, which came about here in the year 1556, it's normally dismissed in one line by saying that that was a missionary press. Its job was to promote religion and to kind of take a religious ideology forward. So my point is that yes, that is partly true, but it's not the only role it played. On the contrary, the press in those times in Goa played a much more crucial role, which you can find if one looks a little bit deeper. So in this short presentation, I'm trying to argue that yes, we are talking about encounters here, but the encounters are not about trade. It's not only about religion. It's more about knowledge, information, and language. There have been intercultural interactions, as is the theme of today's seminar. The question is to understand how these happened, how early in the day it happened, because we are talking about a period that dates back to 1510, which doesn't fit in with most of the stereotypes and paradigms that much of South Asian history has. So as a result, it's often overlooked. Nonetheless, these influences do shape the debate in terms of religion, the religious relations, even till today, the kind of image that Goa carries for itself, built on a stereotype. Even the role of Goa in Bollywood has been studied academically, which is a fascinating subject in itself. It also influences the way academia sees the region. There was, in the call for papers, there was talk about subalterns, and Goa is a strange case, I would argue, because, to use the term by the German-British scholar Margaret Friends, the Goans have been a kind of subaltern elite. At the one hand, they are very much subaltern because of skin color and their place in the pecking order, colonial pecking order. And at another level, in places like East Africa, they kind of get in a kind of middle of the road ranking because of their access to the English language and their role in clerical jobs and things like that. In terms of being a hybrid community, if we define hybridity in terms of a cross between two separate races, here it's quite unusual, because the cross has not been between races but between cultures. And it's most of the community today would consider themselves to be local converts, which they are, and they are culturally shaped by the colonial experience of 451 years, which is a long time, but doesn't get the studies it deserves. And it's a mix of many strange histories in that sense. So for example, just to cite one example, Goa was, as you know, conquered by the Portuguese in 210 on the invite of a local admiral who had some dispute with someone else here. And then along the way, Portugal itself gets ruled by Spain, and Portugal and Spain get blockaded by the Dutch. So the local harbor is blockaded for 4 years or so. And then the French have a role to play in Goan history, in the sense that some dissidents from here, some anti-colonial kind of strategists try to rope in the French. And then along the way, the British also come in and station troops here, saying that Napoleon could invade India through Goa, so we have to station troops there for your own protection and things like that. So it's a really complex history, which is missed. I think it's often this point is kind of missed. And in terms of the diaspora, also Goa's history is waiting to be studied, according to anthropologists like Dr. Robert Newman, formerly of Marblehead in Australia, and now based in Massachusetts in the US. He kind of argues that Goa has one of the highest rates of outmigration in the world per capita. So together with tiny places like Lebanon, Cyprus, bigger places like Ireland and things like that, Goa would have one of the highest per capita outmigration ratios in the world. So just to start at the end of my talk, I want to warn you that, I've used the book as an excuse to understand Goan society, and it's a fascinating story that emerges from it, because the book keeps its trail. Although, as someone pointed out, it's only the written word, it's not the oral word and things like that. But you get a deep insight into what's going on at Goan society at some level. Much of what you find goes beyond the accepted Anglo-centric views of India, of South Asia. The kind of debate that was set in a pre-1947 era, but continues in the post-1947 era. So we find a lot of Indian scholarship today even goes along these lines. So if they cannot understand anything, they would not go into it, or they would dismiss it with some simple argument and things like that. As connected to that is an attempt to create one more of India's diverse histories, and to just place things on, and to place facts on record. Facts, for example, that because of the outmigration, authors from Goa wrote in something like 18 documented and maybe also 20 languages. These are mostly diasporic Goans at different points of time, including in the languages that Dr. Sian was talking about from her part of the world, which is like Tamil and Sinhalese and things like that. And those kind of interesting facts that Goans, from being the center of publishing in Asia at one point in the mid 16th century, actually became, from the core, they became a part of the periphery and had to go all over the world to get their work published, because publishing kind of collapsed over the centuries. So just to put Goa in context, the setting of Goa is what I told you about, the colonial setting and things like that. The way Goa has changed, and also the role Goa has played over the centuries. It's not, of course, it's kept changing. So for example, I have sought to build this argument that in the 16th century, this tiny place on the west coast of India, in South Asia, tries to link, becomes a place which links up Asia with the global knowledge pathways. I'm not saying that this is a equal or a fair exchange, but this is an exchange which needs to be noted, studied, understood. In terms of Britain and Portugal in India, the other points that I think are not properly understood is that very often we see history in isolation from one another. So even today, Goa's history is seen in total isolation from European history. So whatever happened here in the 16th century is seen as unconnected to the conflict in Europe, to the Reformation, to the Counter-Reformation, to the 100-year wars or whatever that were going on there. And I think that is a bit of a problem. Similarly, British history and Portuguese history are always seen as disjunct, but in actual fact, if you look a bit deeper, you find out that the British and even the Dutch, to quite some extent, were following the tracks laid down by the Portuguese. And so you find that cities which grew up into huge British cities, like whether it's Madras or Calcutta or Bombay or Surat for that matter, had some Portuguese connection at an earlier stage in that sense, which are not very often spoken about. Now, coming back to the point, I think that the press in Goa and also the wider kind of knowledge circuit which was sought to be built up here played a crucial role in offering clues about Asia, creating maps, creating letters which gave information to Europe in those days, and which today seems to have been totally forgotten. As far as Britain and Goa is concerned, there is a friend of ours who's actually working on a book, and the working title of it is something like Britain and Goa, a marriage not made for each other, because it's been filled with misunderstandings and complexities. And of course, I'll leave him to come out with that book, which would be very interesting when he actually does, I'm sure. But it has been a complex relationship, and also at times it has been a kind of unexplained relationship. For example, by the 19th century, most Goans were migrating to the British colonies in other parts of the world. So this is mostly British East Africa and places like that, even Malaya and then the Far East and things like that. English has never been a colonial legacy here as far as the language goes. But nonetheless, after 1961 and the transfer of power, it has kind of taken over so completely that these things are never quite understood. So there was this scholar from Israel, Professor Dennis Curzon, who actually did a study on why people from Goa who say that their mother tongue is Konkani actually get such high scores in the test of English as a foreign language. And he wrote a full book based on that. So the central argument I'm making today is that the press in Goa was not decided on by religion alone. It didn't play a role of promoting religion alone. So primarily, yes, but it also played a huge role in promoting languages, in promoting some form of bioprospecting, which also links up with the later points of medicinal plants and finding food sources, mapping out the rest of Asia, influencing the local architecture, and what Martin Page in this fascinating book, it's more journalistic than academic, but it's a fascinating book on the first global village, as he calls it. And although he's British, he kind of takes a very different view of understanding Portuguese colonialism in the world.
Excuse me, Fred. We can only see the first slide. You can't on the big screen. So you have to move. Okay. That's it. You can run through them later if you wish.
Sorry. Yeah. So, yeah. Now it's okay, doctor?
It's fine. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So I was saying that the role of the press in mid 16th century Goa has been all these many things, which is a bit complex and difficult to keep track of, but it's a fascinating field in itself. In keeping with the kind of Anglophone, Anglo-centric research, even today that role is kind of dismissed. So Tranquebar Press, which is one of the younger but influential presses in India, says that the first printing press in Asia was strictly speaking a kidnapped victim. They are referring to the fact that the press that reached in Goa in 1556 was actually meant for Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia, and it stayed here due to some odd set of historical circumstances. But it's kind of dismissed in these one sentence arguments. And on the other hand, Tranquebar, which is another initiative at printing almost 150, 200 years later, initiated by the King of Denmark, executed by German missionaries, financially supported by the British, gets studied much more. And of course, it deserves to be studied, but I think it's not an either or kind of situation. The press in Goa actually worked on a number of languages. So you have Tamil, you have Konkani and Marathi, you have Bengali. You also have later work in Marathi and Hindi. Thomas Stevens is a particularly intriguing character because he comes from Britain and he's a Catholic on the run. So he joins the Jesuits and he spends his life here. And there is an institute in Goa devoted to him now. People are still deciding whether what he wrote was actually Konkani or Marathi, which today are two separate languages. But it's fascinating, the kind of work that was done. Okay. Apart from Goa itself, the wider kind of Padroado context, which is a bit of a complex story to tell, because these guys in history are the bad guys, like, you know, they are the guys on the side of the papacy and, you know, working their way because of papal privilege and things like that. But they've actually worked on all these languages in different parts of Asia. And most of these languages, except Konkani, which is my tiny language, most of them are actually, you know, spoken by 50, 60, 100 million people, which is larger than most European countries today. But of course, they don't have the economic clout to even today to maybe, you know, make such an impact globally. But I think it's important. Sebastião Delgado, the last name at the bottom right, was the person who was a local scholar who actually worked on understanding the influence of the Portuguese language in Asian vocables, as he called it. So he studies language by language in Asia, and what are the words that have influenced the place. The other interesting story, which I won't go into much detail here, is about the early research by the Portuguese going back into Europe, getting translated and getting used as a kind of a source for European understanding of Asia at a later stage. So, you know, these are some of the scholars whose work. Garcia de Horta, the last person, has done some very interesting work on the plants and plant medicine of Asia in the early days. I would argue that today's research on Asia, you know, what you see depends not only on where you stand, but on what language you speak. So because there has been a huge loss of understanding Portuguese and you know, the language itself, very little is done by local scholars or even global scholars, with the exception of, say, a few Portuguese and Brazilians in this field. So this is a comment done by Dr. Pisulerkar, who was the director of archives in both the Portuguese and the post-colonial kind of situation. And he focuses on how the Portuguese and their activities in India are referred to in Indian literature, poems, chronicles, ballads, folklore, and literature in a number of languages. Apart from influencing the books, the early press, and the kind of ecosystem it spawned, also shaped lithography in the region. It created some of the first libraries in Asia here, not the first, but some of the first public libraries in the 1800s, early 1800s, and promoted early higher education in terms of universities of those times, the precursors of the universities as we know them. You have a rich archival, you know, set of records which cover like the West Asian region to the Far East, and of course the general global knowledge transfer which we were talking about. The most interesting story perhaps is, you know, this is just lost to much of research today, but it surfaces once in a way in print journals and, you know, magazines studying the history of print in India, which is not something very often done. So you had this lithographer from a small tiny island off Panjim called Jose Maria Gonçalves, and he worked under Captain Alexander Burns, who went to Afghanistan and places like that during the Great Game between you know, the Russians and the British competing for control over Afghanistan in the early 19th century. So to put things in context, we are at the end of the presentation, but to put things in context, you know, I think we should not forget that Rome, and to a lesser extent Lisbon, in the mid 16th century had become the foremost centers of knowledge production of their time. And apart from that, there is a general view that after the 17th century, Goa was on its decline, so it really played no role in history. So this is some axiom that most historians kind of accept in these parts, at least in Asia today. And, you know, the full thing gets dismissed in a very brief space. But as Dr. Carrera points out, Goa, of course, changed its role, and it didn't play the role it was earlier playing, but it continued being a thriving cultural, religious, and diplomatic hub, building close relations between the foremost continental empires of the day, the Marathas, Mughals, and Mysore, 3 M's. Lastly, my last slide here is that, the conclusions one can draw from all this is very often the narrations of different Indian histories don't fit in too well with the nationalist version of history as we know it, as we've accepted it right from 1947 onwards. So when that kind of problem occurs, it's either dismissed or it's played down or it's overlooked or whatever. For instance, this full thing of the relationship between, say, Portugal and religion, which today in an Asian context is seen like, the full 451 years is seen as a tradition of religious fanaticism and things like that, which it was not, because even in Portugal itself, there were periods, of course, there were strong periods of that. But in Portugal itself, you find that the relationship between the church and the state has been very complex and, keeps changing from the time Portugal is founded as a nation to the time, the church helps to expel the so-called Moors or the Muslims and claims vast lands in returns. And then it loses its position in society. And, it keeps on having these fights between the rulers of the state and making up and, playing a role and not playing a role and being expelled and all these kind of things, So that helps us to see the context in reality. So with that, I'll kind of wind up here. I'm just trying to underline the point that understanding the print history of tiny places like these can help us, perhaps, I would argue, to see in history in a kind of a different lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred Noronha. That was enlightening in terms of the press and the role of the press. There is a hand raised. Let me see. We're in chat. Just a moment, I've lost my chat. I saw a hand raised. Excuse me a second, the technology defies me. Okay, all right. I can't see the raised hand just now, but I had a comment in terms of the Abyssinian. You made a comment about, it was called the Abyssinian press. And it takes me back to the fact that historically, the Portuguese had discovered Ethiopia, the highlands of Ethiopia, as one of the places from where they could extract slaves. So it was not just Arabs who had discovered Abyssinia, Ethiopia, Sudan as a slave extraction region, but the Portuguese were very early over there. And if you would like to comment on that, and that is why one of the languages they have espoused is Amharic. And the press may have served, and this is speculative, I would like you to comment on it, as a venue of Portuguese exceptionalism, because it was the Portuguese were at the height of their powers when they declared Goa their headquarters and established Estado da India, which extended up to from the Cape to China. So it was the press at the beginning about Portuguese exceptionalism, and then maybe it got involved in, again, we're talking about the contact zone transforming the colonizers, because Afonso de Albuquerque did promote marriages with the native inhabitants. And so you had a growing population that was mixed. So I'm asking a number of questions here, but I would like you to comment on the beginnings of the press and the relationship with Ethiopia.
Yeah, Doctor, the Portuguese came so early that everything that that they said or did looks very, very unusual and doesn't fit into this template of understanding history or colonial history in that sense. Even in Ethiopia, more than the press, I think the relationship there, some of my Portuguese friends could bear me out or correct me if I'm wrong. The relationship there was that, the Portuguese were making these claims that they were finding traces of Prester John, who was this mythical, kind of ruler, Christian ruler all over the place. And not only him, even San Tome, they found Saint Thomas the Apostle all over, all over. They found him in India, they found him in Africa, they found him in Brazil. So today, I think scholars in Portugal kind of dismiss this claim as being kind of propagandistic to kind of justify their presence there. But, without going into details, I think because they came so early, and their history looks particularly medieval because it was medieval in that sense, and sometimes we try to fit it into a post-industrial revolution kind of template, and it doesn't fit very well, or, it doesn't make sense to us. So my point of view is that we need to see even Goan history in a wider context.
And the other question I had was that Goa had become so much part of Portuguese culture that, and the Portuguese held on to Goa until 1961, although India became independent in 1947, because the people of Goa also wanted to retain their identity in terms of being Portuguese. And it was only in 1974 that the Portuguese finally signed a treaty of withdrawal with the government of India. So there was definitely a sense of identity that Goans had connected to the Portuguese. And maybe you want to comment a little bit on that Goa is still considering itself as distinctive, unique, its architecture and the language, Konkani Marathi, Konkani Siddhi.
I'm not so sure, doctor, because what answer you get depends on who you're talking to and whom you speak to in that sense, But the fact of the matter remains that, Portuguese history was also in the 20th century was caught up with a whole lot of, kind of problematic things. So I don't think Salazar being there for so many years, the dictator kind of thing helped either Portugal or Goa. And it made the relationship only that much more complex. Otherwise, we could have anticipated a kind of like Pondicherry-like solution to it. But again, it's very different. If you want to understand Goa, you cannot see it in a British kind of template where 47 comes and the British mysteriously pack their bags and go. In that sense, that would have probably not happened here because the situation was so different both here and in the colonial power in that sense. No.
In fact, some Goans, because they were allowed to have a Portuguese passport, migrated to Portugal and preferred to be there instead of in post-independent India, which was already showing the marks of a Hindu majoritarian rule. And as it did happen, the Hindu culture, more or less in terms of politics, took over Goa's politics. And the ethos of Christianity and its distinctive presence of Christianity in Goa through the churches, through the architecture of residences of Goans, is still there. And the present climate in India of Hindutva is trying to silence that presence, which is unique, and trying to, I won't say erase, but put in the background what is important to understanding the diverse history of India. It's like defacing, it's like defacing the monuments of the British and throwing them out, and instead of keeping them as important to understanding our history. So would you comment on that? If you would like to comment.
Yeah, the only thing is it's rather complex because the colonial history has been unhelpful at times, and not, my argument is that the kind of incorporation that Portugal did to its colonies is quite different from the way the Brits did, at least in these parts, Angola, Mozambique were much larger countries, so I don't know how it worked there. But here it was quite different. But again, not everyone felt equally a part of the system, or you know, some of them felt very strongly dispossessed by the system, which was in the 20th century particularly polarized and things like that. So it's complex to say, you know, what would have been the best route. And to a certain extent, I can understand, to a large extent, I can understand the anti-colonial kind of sentiment coming up. And this is part of the 20th century wider global discourse, you know. So people kind of going against religion because religion is so closely connected with the state and the colonial state at that. All these are things which are not entirely, you know, difficult to understand. But 60 years is a long time. This year would be the 60th anniversary of the end of Portuguese rule, and almost 2 generations have passed. So we are seeing already a kind of you know, difference in approach towards the issues of the past. And it's not that people could recoup their Portuguese citizenship then; they can still do it now. So you know, people are still leaving, but that's also, there's an economic edge to that. They are doing it for, you know, because it's a ticket to the EU and things like that. But so it's extremely complex. That's all I can say.
Yes, it's true. But then the majoritarian Hindu government is also going along religious lines. I mean, we can't we can't escape the fact that religion is once more being used in terms of a national identity and the erasure of other identities at the expense of the diverse culture of India is what I'm commenting on, thanks to your presentation, which looks at the unique history of Goa and how the printing press has also espoused other languages and other cultures in that sense. It also reminds me of Benedict Anderson's work on the printing press as a force of unification in terms of identities. So thank you for that presentation. Shihan, if you have any comments.
I actually have a very intriguing question. I hope Fred will be able to answer this. The Portuguese were very low on their resources, and they had very ingenious tactics of living symbiosis, if you like, wherever they went. And can you explain a bit about Goa? Because the world implies that Goa was Portuguese. So you're talking about Portuguese Goa. So can you tell us a bit of the history, like how much was Hindu and how much is Sindhu, the river Mandavi and the divisions? And also I'd like to know, because there were mistakes made on both sides, how the Portuguese mistook Hindu religions for being Catholics, you know, the worship of Kali, for drinking, you know, like wine. So have there been these, with the printing press, have you seen any writings on Eastern philosophies that did any Portuguese take an interest, apart from the botanical interest and word lists to improve their linguistics? Now I'm interested, did they want to know about the Eastern philosophies? Did they write back and send them, or even hope to send them back? Because in my work on Indo-Portuguese, I find words like Rakshasa and Patini and Yaksha. I mean, these are borrowed words into Indo-Portuguese, because that is the language, that the intermediary language that they spoke.
Interesting, doctor. I think that you know, at the early stages, it was a very utilitarian kind of approach. So they were going in for plant-based medicines. There's a historian called Dr. Timothy Walker who was looking at the ship manifest to see what the ships were carrying in terms of medicinal plants back to Europe in that sense. So they had a very clear kind of utilitarian approach that we need something which is going to help us directly. Languages also help them directly in the sense of promoting hegemony of a sort. Later on in the 19th, 20th century, you find a lot of fascination in Portugal and in Portuguese writing. I think there is a book written by Ethel Pope in English, which talks about India and Portugal in that sense, the imagination of India and Portugal. So it takes time for that kind of equation to develop, but it seems to be that, you know, the kind of equation that the Portuguese had with India is very different from the kind that the British had with India, because it was from a different time frame, and maybe the arrogance was less, and as you say, they were still struggling to make things work for them, you know. And of course, when you look back, they were a huge success at one point in history, but they were a tiny nation in that sense, you know, maybe 2 million people at all stages. As far as the religious breakup is concerned, there are scholars who feel that it's not as great as it's made out to be, because, you know, even people like us who are converts at some point in history, you know, we become them at some point in history. Like, you know, we and them kind of blurs, and we know that we are them, and we know that okay, we may not like religious extremism or whatever, but where do you, like, we have a caste system in Catholicism which is followed not in the religious sense of the word, but in the social sense of the word till today. So how do you explain that? You know, so people find the Goan form of Catholicism very quaint, and there have been some studies on it done. So it's, you know, I don't know whether we should see it as something so antagonistic, though in our current discourse, people would like to posit it as such, but I'm not so sure that, you know, it should be seen as such.
All right, thank you.
I think I provoked Joanna enough to say something.
Yes, Joanna has a comment. Joanna, would you like to address?
Actually, I have to go now. So I was just writing a comment to say goodbye, because I have to engage somewhere else. But just to say that I agree with Frederick that it is a very complex history, and if sometimes people want us to simplify an answer, but in the case of Go, I think there are no simple answers. But I think Frederick said something very important to help you to understand that. And one is you have a particular time frame, is medieval. The first stage is medieval, so you have to understand it outside of the Anglo, of the British colonial model, because it was something else. It was more of a trade network and evangelical practice, if I can call it like that. And then I think what the question Shehan brought up is important. Yes, there were some scholars that were interested in learning about Hindu culture and civilization, and especially in 20th century, beginning 20th century, final 19th century, you have some periodicals, you have some press where you see that Goans were trying to write in Portuguese, explaining Hindu culture, Hindu religion, and Hindu civilization. And if they were writing about that, I think they would imagine they have a public, you understand? They would imagine they have an audience. I don't know how successful they were, but Frederick can vouch for that. I mean, Revista da Índia, for example, Luz do Oriente, another publication, you could have translations of sacred Hindu scriptures and everything, but I don't think that many people would read these at that time. Those magazines, these were elite publications, I would say, and on that sense, you can see, yes, that there was an interest for Hindu culture, but pretty much I have the sense that people shared the territory, but they lived in different worlds. Not that there was a conflict necessarily, but like they lived apart in the same territory. I don't know if Frederick would agree with that. That's the impression I have. So
it was more class-based than religious-based, and this thing, the French term of, you know, kind of incorporation into the cultural system. The term used was someone just, the earlier speaker used it, no, where
assimilation,
assimilado. So in that sense, it was that same theory was important in a Goan context also. Either you were assimilados or not. If you were educated and you had a lyceum education, then you were part of the system, regardless of your religion. In some parts of history, not when you had you know, more of a theocracy.
Yes, thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Fred.
I think, Fred, that was, you touched on a very big question there with a small comment, because Portuguese identity, to be part of the Portuguese, in Sri Lanka, you find people who converted, who didn't convert, but just took on Portuguese names and were written down as Portuguese. And the Coimbra scholar who died, I think the Portuguese would know his name. He wrote about this, that simply wearing a hat made somebody Portuguese. So Portuguese identity was normally Portuguese speaking of Creole, Pidgin, whatever, and Roman Catholic. But yes, if you wore a hat even, you could become, a Portuguese.
Yeah, and you said hat twice this evening, so I can't resist that temptation. They were called chepekards or shapio or some such word from that.
Yes.
So Christians wore hat and Hindus wore turban. And just the other day, a friend was explaining to me how different kind of Hindus, caste, occupation based, wore different kind of turbans. So I guess your headgear is a kind of your identity also in that era. So you were the hat wearers if you were westernized. No.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for that very lively discussion.